Mention the word environmentalism, and it's likely that most people will think of protesting environmental activists, most of them operating far left of the political center. But you don't have to be a left-winger to care about the environment. A recent issue of National Review featured an article titled "Toward a Conservative Environmentalism." It touts the potential of a congressional group called the Roosevelt Conservation Caucus. Is this group on the right track? Do its supporters follow some of the same bad ideas as environmentalists on the left? Well, joining us to discuss these questions is Don Vaart. He's a senior fellow at the John Locke Foundation, and he worked for nearly 3 decades at North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality, serving as its leader, the departmental secretary under Republican Governor Pat McCrory. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, first of all, let's talk a little bit about some of the things in this article, Toward a Conservative Environmentalism, that you agree with. The author of this piece really takes it to the folks who are on the left and their approach to environmentalism, and you think that he gets that part right.
Well, yes, I think the article correctly identifies the most recent shift in the environmental movement. It's not that recent, I think it is to the author, which is that the impetus is more founded on an anti-humanist approach. And for those who don't know what that is, that essentially means that some level of population control is needed for this movement, is needed to protect the environment. In other words, simply putting controls on or limiting the kinds of fuels or cleaning up fuels, all those typical environmental management tools aren't enough, according to this movement. And what you really need is a reduction in the number of people and a fundamental change in the standard of living. And really underlying that approach is this more socialist economic framework, because otherwise you don't have the control that you need.
And you see some of this in North Carolina's own plans developed in the Cooper administration to deal with environmental issues.
Well, I don't think Cooper can take any credit for originalism, but they have co-opted the national position of these more left-wing environmental groups, and most people will have heard of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is really a sort of a manifesto. It's really an economic manifesto written by the anti-humanist organizations.
One of the things that we have seen that fits in with this whole pattern is the positive reaction among some of these left-of-center environmentalists to what has happened since the COVID-19 pandemic. They're saying, hey, fewer people are driving, people aren't going out and about. This is great. We need more of this.
And that's exactly the position that the anti-humanists would pursue, which is we need to change the way we live. We need to, in fact, we need a strong central government that can actually direct, this is some of their strategies, direct who gets certain levels of energy and who doesn't. They would have you believe that they would direct more energy, for example, for fundamental manufacturing or needed manufacturing. It's rife with crony capitalism, and we can go on about that. The issue, though, from a environmental standpoint, is that I've never seen a real nexus to that environmental improvement. Even in this case with the COVID, you don't see dramatic reductions in certain pollutants. It isn't the case that they would have you believe it is. It's really about changing social norms.
We are chatting with Don Vaart. He is a senior fellow at the John Locke Foundation and former secretary of North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality. Let's switch gears a little bit. This article talked about what's wrong with the environmental left, and then it suggested there are some ideas about how conservatives can take on a more active role in dealing with environmental issues, and focuses specifically on this Roosevelt Conservative Caucus or Conservation Caucus that was set up in the Congress a little bit more than a year ago. What do you think about these ideas?
Well, one of the premises that is totally wrong in this article and others is that they take as axiomatic that the conservatives or the Republicans, however you want to characterize them, are somehow anti-conservation, anti-environment, and that's absolutely false. I've worked through many different administrations, and I can tell you most of the professional staff have a very clear idea of what they need to do, and that goes forward. Those are all based on the fundamental structure that was put in place by the EPA, which, remember, was started by Richard Nixon. Yes, it's highly inefficient, and yes, there is a lot of wasted effort. But if you look back at the time when the EPA began to the time we are now, it has been a wildly successful effort. And that goes across both Democrat and Republican administrations. It's absolutely false. It's a political narrative to say that somehow Republicans or conservatives are anti-environment. So that really segues into where we are now. The unfortunate thing for environmentalists is they really have done a very good job, and we are very successful. Our air, our water, and our solids, our groundwater, it's amazing how much cleaner they are now than they were 30 and 40 years ago. And so now the question is to remain relevant, what do we do? And what's happened is they've been sort of hijacked by this anti-humanist effort. And at the UN level, at the global level, they've been hijacked by socialists. And so what this article then goes on about, and they get this right. They figure out that what I've just talked about, the fact that America's environment is so much cleaner now than it was 34 years ago, so much cleaner than other developed nations, because we've had the good fortune of having a capitalist system in place, and we've been able to create the wealth necessary to implement these costly strategies. And so now where are we? We've got to come up with another boogeyman, and that is climate change.
Yeah, in fact, there's a sentence near the beginning of this article. It says the formation of this Roosevelt caucus that we mentioned signaled the beginning of a new era in conservative politics characterized by a heightened concern for environmental issues such as climate change. I'm sure you read that and cringed.
The fact of the matter is that to the extent man has a role in global warming, even the EPA under Obama recognized that we're talking about 100-year manifestation. It's going to take 100 years to get to the point where we're seeing changes, and so we have some time, and I think that's why you see some before COVID, we had some really rather shrill arguments about how climate change is going to befall us in the next 12 years, and then that was passed, and it became increasingly panic-stricken. The fact of the matter is the professionals who do this at the EPA, like I said, they're working with a 100-year timeline, and there are things we can put in place to the extent man plays a role. That nothing new about this, and I think what you really have to look at now is who and how are the adults in the room going after this issue. Nothing's new about it. I think politically there may be some people who are trying to straddle the fence, but it's just not realistic to say this is a new phenomenon.
Let's tackle some other pieces of this article, some of which I think you might go along with, or some of which you might go along with an asterisk. One is this idea that to address environmental issues, we do need to deal with markets and not just government. That sounds right.
Right, and there have been a lot. There have been programs that have been put in place. One is the acid rain program, which was based on a market, a contrived and constructed marketplace, but it essentially gave people credits to pollute, and then it reduced the total number of credits, and so they were able to use a sort of a marketplace to exchange with other folks' credit holders, and they've developed the most efficient way of spending their credits. It worked, and it continues to work. So the issue here is where they're going with this, of course, is some sort of a carbon tax, a CO2 tax, a BTU tax, something like that. And it's a construct. The marketplace will be a construct, and then the good news is once you've constructed this market, then the marketplace itself will decide how best to distribute those credits. I don't think that makes sense in theory. But I don't think we're at the point where we need to impose those kinds of costs to make real differences. And the obvious answer here is we need to look harder at nuclear, and we need to develop a strategy so that we can get those nuclear plants online. We can keep the ones that we've got continuing to operate, but we also need to look at putting new ones online. That's the only way you're going to get real reductions in CO2 while maintaining and improving our standard of living.
You brought up nuclear, and that was interesting in that not only is this something that we know that the environmental left doesn't like, but we really didn't hear much about that in this article, either about, hey, let's have nuclear play more of a role. Why do you think that is?
It is essentially the anathema to the anti-humanist movement. And Amory Lovins, for example, who co-wrote the administrator, the Governor Cooper's CEP, Clean Energy Plan, which again is really just a watered-down version of the Green New Deal. He's a devotee of anti-humanism, and he has stated on numerous occasions that having cheap, abundant, and affordable energy is not in the best interest of the anti-humanists, because what we'll do is we will actually increase development, increase our standard of living, and that's exactly what they don't want. And so this article, the Green New Deal, Governor Cooper's Clean Energy Plan, are effectively plans that try to implement an anti-humanist strategy, which necessarily must avoid cheap electricity.
You mentioned plans, and that ties into something else that's mentioned in this article, and I think you might be more amenable to this piece than others, and if not, you could tell me. But it says at one point in this article, in keeping with market-based principles, a conservative approach to conservation seeks to push power downwards to local communities whenever possible, understanding that rule by federal diktat is a clumsy and unwieldy tool that rarely accomplishes what it sets out to do and often foments political backlashes from the indignant bearers of its consequences. The idea of not having the federal government dictate everything, that tends to be a conservative approach. Does it work here?
It does work in environmental management to try to push these things down to the local level. I'd say probably at the state level is about as far as you can go with input from the county level. And there's the reason that's so. There are many reasons why that's true, but one of the main reasons is that our country is complete. The ecologies, the topographies, the geologies are so different from state to state that it's just impossible to try to rule, so to speak, from the central EPA headquarters. And again, as I said earlier, what the implementation of Richard Nixon's original EPA was with a very strong state involvement. It's been wildly successful. It could be more efficient, much more efficient, but it is wildly successful. It's not clear, and this article, I think, correctly points that out. It's not clear. They don't go very far into what they see in terms of fleshing that out, but I understand it's simply a very short article. But yes, I would agree that generally speaking, you need to have the implementation at the local level.
So as we wrap things up, we know that you don't agree with the anti-humanist left-of-center version of environmentalism, and it sounds as if you have some questions about how the right-of-center version as spelled out in this article or in the Roosevelt Conservation Caucus would move forward. What would you recommend as the best way for those who are interested in environmental issues from a conservative perspective? What's the best thing for us to do and to pursue?
Well, there are two. The one is that it's absolutely critical that you have a strong and robust economy. Otherwise, you don't have the resources to clean the environment and to protect the environment. You can look at any other country in around the globe, and you'll see the same thing. You don't work your way up to a robust environmental management program without a robust economy. But second, I think we really lose sight. We have lost sight of the fact that science ought to be dictating this, and I think it always worries me when you have a lot of politicians sitting around saying this is what we ought to do for the environment, and really what you probably have is one or two staffers slipping in the vernacular and very little of the science. And so I would have scientists play more active role in any strategy that would that they're coming up with. That's what you're seeing that's missing, for example, in the Green New Deal, and it's missing in Cooper's energy plan. There's very little science. There's a lot about politics. And you've got to remember the underlying motivation behind the Green New Deal and the most recent series of plans have been to destroy capitalism and to really foment a more socialist economic model.